was raised in a pretty left-wing family, so as a younger high school student, I sort of gravitated towards like communism and that, because I mean during the 80s and the Cold War, communism was sort of the only alternative to capitalism. And then as I went on to do political studies in university, I just sort of kept reading and eventually came across anarchism as a political philosophy, and basically sort of agreed with it and sort of accepted it as a philosophy.
I think the first anarchist I met when I was living in Victoria, BC, had a big influence in my life. Lindsay was super involved in like food not bombs and community gardening and compost education and just like really like community-based stuff. Like she wasn't walking around saying, "Hey, I'm an anarchist," in this as the first thing that she said, but she definitely would talk about it if you asked. But she really she talked about her politics by what she did, so that really introduced me to like just anarchism in practice.
I was sort of brought up in a conservative Christian background and used to be pretty much comfortable with capitalism and whatnot, although I tended to lean toward socialism. And then I began to read things that were really critical of the system, the establishment, and civilization. And then to read anarchist thinkers. And the more I read of that, I guess the more I realized how much sense it made.
My father began to read more and more anti-civilizationist writings, so I heard a lot of those ideas, and then in the past few years actually began to understand them more and read about them and formulate my own opinions.
I was doing a degree in international development and spending a lot of time learning about and researching about other cultures and histories and places. And more I found that in seeking for a kind of decent way of life that people could live in and be happy, that most people in most places and most times, when they weren't under some sort of oppression from some empire, were living in small human scale groups, making decisions together, and relatively non-hierarchical, relatively simple and adaptive. And it seemed to me like the best thing that we could come up with or want to try and copy in any way. And the options that were being given at that time, people were talking about working in these large status structures, either within communism or capitalism. And neither of those sounded really very appealing at all when we're looking at quality of life for people, for the most people. And so I wrote an honors thesis about it, and I called it Indigenism. And people would say, "Do you believe in capitalism or communism?" And I'd say, "Neither. I believe in this Indigenism." And eventually I found out, years later, while hanging out with and working with anarchists, as folks who seemed reasonably close in beliefs and allies in what I was trying to do, I found out that not only is what I was calling Indigenism a type of anarchism, it's anarcho-primitivism.
I went off to Europe for school. I got a scholarship, and I met anarchists there that I didn't know existed, and I learned from just kids on the street. Most of my ideas, and since then it's just been continuous meeting people and going through the community and reading lots, and playing music, or listening to music especially. That's where I get a lot of my theories from.
It was probably originally, like when I was young, was through punk rock and punk rock bands, through lyrics, but also through like self-published fanzines and magazines that people would write in and explore a lot of different ideas. This stuff came out a lot. I was reading Noam Chomsky and a lot of what he said, and it was actually like way more moderate than you would expect lots of anarchists to be. You'd expect it based on like media, the way media portrayals of anarchists are and stuff. You'd expect them to be like wanting to throw bombs and stuff all the time. And so reading this guy who was way more moderate and had a kind of like really just sensible view of how people could treat each other better, I kind of ended up being like, well, if you can be this kind of middle of the road and consider yourself an anarchist, then I could do it too.